The forest held its breath. Even the wind seemed to vanish as the sound of hooves and boots broke the stillness. Three armed strangers emerged from the shadows, eyes scanning, hungry for trouble and certain they would find it. They didn't know this land belonged to someone who feared nothing, except losing her. Three men with guns moved into the forest, searching for what they should never find. He stepped out from the trees, alone, his bow drawn to a killing line. One more arrow, and it would be over. But he lowered it slowly, not from fear, but for her, the woman he swore to protect, even if it meant keeping his heart from becoming like his enemies. And in that moment, she knew he was truly, undeniably home. The Nevada Territory, autumn of 1875, was a land painted in golden shadow. Pines stretched endlessly toward the sky, their needles whispering secrets in the crisp wind. Golden leaves spun down from cottonwoods, catching the afternoon light before drifting into the winding trail that carved its way through the mountains. The air carried the scent of pine resin and distant rain, and every sound seemed sharpened by the season's stillness. Through this wilderness rattled a stagecoach, its wheels groaning over ruts and rocks. Inside sat a young woman, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, though her posture betrayed a quiet unease. She had left behind the crowded streets and polished drawing rooms of New York, bound for California and a marriage she had not chosen. Her father's word had been final, and so she had obeyed, though her heart felt as if it lagged behind somewhere along the eastern rails. Two trunks of fine linen and lace pressed against her knees, reminders of the life she was expected to continue. A life of manners, of duty, of silence. Outside, the driver clucked to the horses, guiding them toward the shallow bend of a river swollen from recent rains. The water shimmered darkly under a sky veiled in thin clouds. They entered the crossing, hooves splashing into the current, when the first sound split the air, a low, eerie howl from the tree line beyond. The horses jerked their heads, nostrils flaring. Another howl answered, closer this time, followed by the sudden, sinuous movement of gray shapes between the trees. Wolves. A whole pack, their eyes bright and fixed on the struggling coach. The lead horse reared, panic spreading like fire down the harness. The driver shouted, yanking the reins, but the current tugged hard at the wheels. The front left sank into mud with a sucking groan. The sudden tilt threw the young woman against the side wall. The wolves burst from cover, snarling, closing the gap. The driver's whip cracked, but the horses screamed in terror. Wood splintered. The coach lurched violently, then tipped. Her world became a whirl of icy water and dark shapes. The river swallowed her before she could draw breath. Heavy skirts wrapped around her legs, dragging her under. She kicked, clawed, struck something hard, a trunk, a rock, her lungs burning. Above her, pale light flickered. She reached for it, but the current was merciless. The last thing she felt was the cold crushing her chest. And then, nothing. Cold seeped into her bones before she even opened her eyes. The air was sharp, heavy with the smell of wet earth and river silt. Somewhere nearby, water thundered and churned, the river's voice relentless as it rushed over rocks. She stirred, coughing hard, her lungs aching with every breath. Mud clung to her face, her hair, the soaked remnants of her gown. Each movement sent a jolt of pain through her hip, and her arms trembled as she tried to push herself upright. The world was a haze of pale mist rising from the riverbank, curling like ghostly fingers into the pines. That was when she heard it, a low, guttural growl. Her head turned sharply. Three wolves stood just beyond the fog, their bodies lean and tense, eyes glowing with a feral yellow light. They moved with the slow confidence of predators that knew their prey was too weak to flee. One stepped forward, lips peeling back to reveal sharp teeth, a string of drool catching the dim light. Her voice broke as she whispered, "Help me!" The lead wolf crouched to spring. A sharp whistle split the air, followed by the hiss of something fast. An arrow struck the ground inches from the wolf's paw. It startled, snarling, as another arrow came from the mist, this one embedding deep into the soil before its nose. The pack froze, ears flicking toward the unseen threat. From the shadow of the trees he emerged, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing weathered leather and beads that caught the faint light. His hair, long and black, framed a face carved by wind and sun, unreadable yet calm. The bow in his hand was still half drawn, an arrow nocked and ready. The wolves hesitated only a moment longer before melting back into the forest, their shapes dissolving into the mist. She tried to speak, but only a hoarse gasp escaped. He approached slowly, crouching beside her. Without touching her skin, he draped a thick wool blanket over her shivering shoulders. His voice, low and deliberate, carried a strange gentleness. "You are safe." Before she could protest, he lifted her with surprising ease, cradling her as though she weighed nothing. Step by step, he carried her away from the roar of the river, up a hidden trail winding through the pines. The forest closed around them, the mist swallowing their path until only the sound of his steady footsteps and her ragged breathing remained. Leading toward a cabin she had never imagined existed. The cabin was small, but every inch of it felt alive with warmth. Firelight danced over the rough-hewn walls, casting shadows across animal hides that hung like silent guardians. The scent of pine resin and wood smoke wove through the air, softening the sharp chill she'd carried in from the river. He laid her gently onto a thick blanket near the hearth. For a moment the world felt distant. The howls, the icy water, the yellow eyes in the mist, all muffled by the crackle of the fire. When she woke again, a clay cup rested beside her, steam curling from its rim. The bitter taste of herbs coated her tongue, chased by the faint sweetness of honey. She glanced toward the low table where he worked silently, grinding dried roots with a carved pestle. Her hips still throbbed, but the worst of the pain dulled under his careful tending. He replaced the poultice without a word, his hands steady, movements precise. Over the next days, the rhythm became familiar. Water fetched from the stream each morning, food placed by her side. The steady presence of a man who never hovered yet was always near. He didn't ask where she'd come from or why she'd been in the river. It was in the quiet hours, when the wind rattled softly against the shutters, that she began to speak. "My father," she started one night, eyes fixed on the fire, "arranged my marriage. California, a man I've never met." She forced a dry laugh. "They say he's powerful. I imagine he wants a wife who knows how to stay silent." He didn't comment, only listened. The silence was not the dismissive kind she'd known before. It was a space for her words to settle. Another evening, she gathered the courage to ask his name. "Ayoka," he said at last. The word rolled low from his chest, its edges softened by an accent unfamiliar to her ears. Later still, he told her a fragment of his past. Captured by soldiers when he was 13, kept in a cage for moons, released into a world that no longer knew where he belonged. She didn't press for more. Some truths were carried like scars, shown only when the light was right. And so, in that small cabin of firelight and shadows, two strangers began the slow work of knowing each other, not through questions, but through the quiet mercy of shared space and time. The wind had changed. It came whispering through the cracks in the shutters, thin and sharp, carrying with it the taste of snow from the high ridge. The sky outside had turned the color of old pewter, heavy and low, as if winter itself was leaning in to watch. By midday, she could no longer keep her eyes open for more than a few moments. Her skin burned with heat, but her body shivered beneath the blankets. Beads of sweat slid down her temples, dampening the loose strands of hair clinging to her face. He noticed before she spoke a word. The moment her hand trembled while reaching for the cup, he set it aside and touched her forehead with the back of his fingers. The heat there told him enough. He moved quickly, gathering herbs from a hanging bundle near the hearth, grinding them into a fine powder, and steeping them in boiling water. He soaked cloths in the cool stream outside, his breath clouding in the frigid air, before hurrying back in to lay them across her brow. Through the fever, she called out in broken whispers, "Mama, Mama, please don't go." The words carried the helplessness of a child, not the woman who had braved a river's current in the wolf's teeth. He stayed. When she thrashed, he caught her hand in his, not to restrain, but to anchor her. When she fell silent except for the ragged draw of her breath, he pressed the rim of the cup to her lips, coaxing her to drink. Hour after hour, night into day, he watched her face for signs of change. By the second night, her fever broke. The fire had burned low, casting the cabin in deep shadows. She stirred, her eyes glassy but clearer than before. The first thing she saw was him, sitting with his back against the wall, his head slightly bowed, exhaustion etched into his features. "You stayed!" Her voice was no more than a rasp. His eyes opened fully. "You are strong," he said simply. "I didn't feel strong." "You survived." She closed her eyes again, but this time sleep came without the fever's cruel grip. Somewhere deep inside she understood. His hands had not only kept her alive, they had given her back the right to rest. The rain had passed in the night, but its weight still clung to the earth. Mist coiled over the river like pale smoke, and the banks had turned to deep, sucking mud. From the cabin's doorway, she saw him leave at dawn, his bow slung over one shoulder, disappearing into the trees without a sound. Hours later, he returned, but his steps were heavier, his face unreadable. Mud streaked the hem of his leggings, and in one hand he carried a small scrap of fabric. He set it on the table between them. It was a handkerchief embroidered with her initials in golden thread, now dulled by dirt and rain. She touched it with trembling fingers, recognizing it instantly. It had been packed in her trunk, the one that had gone into the river. Her voice was quiet. "You found it where?" He met her eyes briefly. "Downstream, carriage broken, trunks, clothes, no tracks, no bodies." She swallowed hard, waiting for him to add something. A sign, a clue that others had survived. None came. "No one's looking for me," she said at last. He didn't speak, but his silence told her the truth. She sat back, letting the weight of it settle. A month ago, the thought of being forgotten would have crushed her. Now it brought something sharper, clarity. "I want you to teach me," she said. He frowned. "Teach? How to live here? How to survive without you if I have to?" For a long moment he studied her face as if measuring the resolve in her words. Then he crossed the cabin to a wooden chest, opened it, and drew out a bundle wrapped in dark cloth. When he unwrapped it, she saw a small knife, the blade narrow and sharp, the handle wrapped in worn hide. "This is not for killing," he said, placing it in her palm. "It is for cutting, carving, making. Only use it to defend. Never for anger." The weight of it surprised her. Heavier than it looked, solid and real. She curled her fingers around the handle, nodding once. "I understand." And in that moment, she knew she had crossed an invisible threshold. She was no longer waiting to be rescued. She was learning how to rescue herself. The mountains woke before the sun. Mist drifted low through the pines, and a narrow stream chattered over stones, its voice weaving through the crisp air. The scent of damp earth and pine needles was everywhere, mingling with the faint smoke from the cabin's early fire. This was her classroom now. He led her along faint trails that wound between moss-covered rocks, speaking little but pointing often, a set of delicate tracks in the soft earth. "Rabbit," he said. She crouched, tracing the print with her fingertips, memorizing the shape. Another morning, he showed her how to strip damp bark and coax it into flame, the smoke curling upward in slow blue tendrils. Her hands blistered at first. The bow drill bit into her palms, the raw edge of effort making her hiss under her breath. He didn't step in to finish the task for her. He only nodded toward the kindling until at last the spark caught. Her smile in that moment was small but fierce. By the stream, he taught her how to weave branches into a snare, their arcs bending just so to spring with the right tension. She learned to crush leaves between her fingers, releasing scents that meant healing or harm. In the evenings, when the forest grew still and the fire painted the cabin in gold, they traded words. She pointed to her hair. "Hair," she said. "Tilaje," he replied. She repeated it carefully, earning the faintest quirk of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but close. He pointed to the fire. "Ta." She said it back, her tongue shaping the unfamiliar sound until it felt natural. Some nights they spoke more with their eyes than with their voices, a hand brushing hers as he passed a bowl, the shared glance when a joke hung unspoken between them. Silence was no longer a gap to fill. It was a bridge they both stood on. One evening, as they sat watching embers glow, she realized she no longer marked time by days or hours. Time here moved in lessons learned, in the soft rhythm of footsteps side by side, in the quiet certainty that she was becoming someone different. And though neither said it aloud, each knew survival was no longer his task alone. It was theirs. The forest was too quiet. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Only the faint sigh of wind threading through the branches, carrying with it the last gold light of the setting sun. She stood near the cabin's doorway, feeling the stillness press in, until she saw him pause mid-step, his head turning toward the trees. He set down the bundle of firewood he carried. "Stay inside," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. From the shadowed pines, three figures emerged. Their boots were caked in mud, coats worn, but their rifles well kept. One wore a red bandana around his neck, another chewed a toothpick with lazy defiance, and the third had restless eyes that never stopped moving. "Well now," the one with the toothpick drawled, his voice carrying too easily in the silence. "Didn't expect to find anyone out here. We're just looking for a warm fire, and maybe something to eat." "There's nothing for you here," he replied, his voice calm, steady. The red bandana man chuckled, stepping forward. "Don't be unfriendly. We could pay." "No." The third man's gaze flicked to the cabin door, where she stood just inside the shadows. "Looks like you've got more than firewood to keep you warm." Before the words could sink further into the air, he stepped forward from the tree line, his bow in hand, the string drawn taut. The arrow pointed at the ground, but the line of his shoulders spoke of precision, of the distance between life and death being one breath away. "You should turn around," he said. The toothpick man smirked and took another step. The hiss of the arrow's release cut the moment clean in two. It struck the dirt an inch from the man's boot. The smirk vanished. "Jesus," one muttered. The three exchanged glances, their bravado fraying. Hands half raised, they backed toward the trees. "You'll regret this," the red bandana called over his shoulder. "Go," he answered simply. When the forest swallowed them, she stepped outside. "You could have killed him," she said softly. "I've killed before," he replied. Then after a pause, "But not today." She understood. His strength was not only in his aim, it was in knowing when not to let the arrow fly. Winter had settled in with a quiet, relentless grip. Frost clung to the edges of the newly built fence, each post capped with a crown of white. A thin veil of mist drifted through the clearing, softening the outline of the cabin until it seemed part of the mountain itself. She pulled her shawl tighter as she worked beside him, her breath clouding in the cold air. The two of them moved in easy rhythm, hauling wood to the pile, tightening the fence rails, checking the traps before dusk. No one gave orders anymore. They simply knew what needed doing, and they did it together. It was in that rhythm she realized she had crossed an invisible line. She was no longer a guest in this place. She belonged to its work, its silences, its stubborn will to endure. The sound came first as a faint echo, the distant thud of hooves on frozen ground. She straightened, squinting through the mist toward the tree line. Slowly, shapes emerged, four riders in dark coats, moving at an unhurried pace. When they drew closer, the voice calling her name cut through the cold air like a blade. It was a name from another life, spoken with the authority of someone who believed she would answer. Her chest tightened. She could picture the faces. Cousins, servants, people who had once filled the hallways of her father's house. They had come, perhaps, to retrieve her, to fold her back into a life she had never chosen. She glanced toward him. He had paused in his work but hadn't moved to intervene. His eyes met hers, steady and unreadable, as if telling her this choice was hers alone. The riders slowed, scanning the clearing. One called her name again, louder this time. She stayed where she was, the mist curling between them, her hands gripping the rough wood of the fence rail. She didn't speak. After a long moment, the riders turned their horses and melted back into the trees, their voices fading into the distance. Only when the forest swallowed them did she breathe again. She turned back to her work, her decision as solid as the frost under her boots. She had chosen, and she was not going back. The climb had been long, but neither hurried. Step by step, they followed a narrow path through the pines until the trees fell away and the sky opened above them. From the ridge, the world stretched wide, a sweep of gold and amber as the autumn valley lay below, the grasses rippling in the wind like the surface of a sunlit river. The air was crisp, tinged with the faint spice of dry leaves. She stood there for a moment, drawing it in. Months ago, this view would have been nothing more than scenery. Now it felt like proof. Proof of the ground she had walked, the storms she had weathered, the life she had chosen. He reached into the pouch at his side, his movements deliberate. When his hand emerged, it held a band of soft, hand-tooled leather, the center set with a smooth oval stone, the color of deep river water. The stone caught the sunlight, glowing faintly as if it held its own quiet flame. "This," he said, his voice low, "is not a ring from the white world. But if you wear it, it means you stay. You choose this place. You choose me." Her breath caught. No man had ever asked her to choose in such a way, not as a command, not as a bargain, but as an offering. She held out her wrist without hesitation. His fingers were steady as he tied the band, knotting it twice. The leather warmed from his touch. When he was done, he kept her hand in his for a moment longer, his eyes meeting hers with a weight that needed no translation. They turned to the cedar standing just behind the ridge. Its trunk was thick with age, its bark weathered by years of wind and snow. With his knife, he began to carve the outline of an eagle, wings outstretched in flight. She took the blade when he offered it and, with care, etched the first letter of her name beneath it. Side by side, their marks took shape, a sign no one else needed to understand but them. When it was done, they stood back to look at it. The eagle seemed ready to lift from the bark, carrying their vows into the open sky. They spoke then, in the mingled syllables of his language and hers. His palm pressed over her heart as he said, "You live in my fire." Her fingertips touched his brow as she answered, "You walk in my sky." The wind rose, swirling around them, carrying their words down into the valley as if the land itself bore witness. By the time they descended, the light had softened to the warm gold of late afternoon. The cabin came into view, smoke curling from its chimney, the fence standing firm against the frost. She looked at it and saw not just shelter, but the first stones of a home they would build together. And somewhere deep inside, she knew this was not the end of her journey. It was the beginning of theirs. Out here in the Old West, the mountains and rivers keep their secrets, but the lessons still ride with us into the present day. Charlotte's choice to stay, and Ayoka's strength in protecting without destroying, remind us that survival is more than just staying alive. It's about deciding what kind of person you will be when the choice is yours. In today's world, we may not face wolves or armed strangers, but we face challenges just as real. Choosing kindness when anger is easier, standing by those who cannot repay us, and building trust slowly, even when the world tells us to guard ourselves. These lessons are timeless. Some will say Charlotte's decision to stay was brave. Others might say it was reckless. Was it love that kept her in the mountains, or the freedom she found there? Could she have built the same strength if she'd returned to her old life? That's the beauty of stories like this. The answers aren't carved in stone. They live in the space where we can talk, imagine, and even disagree. So I'll leave you with a question. In her place, what would you have done? Would you choose the safety of the life you knew, or the uncertainty of the life you wanted? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone. And if this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you that courage can be quiet and love can be steadfast, then give it a like, share it with a friend, and subscribe so you don't miss the next ride into the West. This is the West that never left, where the frontier lives on, not just in history, but in the choices we make today.